If you listen to most Christian discussions about salvation across history, the argument almost always sounds the same. The debate is framed as faith versus works. One side says salvation requires faith and works. Another side, salvation is by faith alone. And for centuries, that has sounded like the central theological battlefield of Christianity. But what if that entire argument, as it has been historically framed, has been happening one level above the real issue? What if the real issue was never first faith versus works? What if the real issue was always revelation? Because whatever you believe revelation is will determine what you believe faith is. And whatever you believe faith is will determine what you believe salvation is. The church very early inherited the apostolic language of faith, works, grace, and truth. But language can survive while conceptual frameworks drift. And what I'm about to argue is that the church largely preserved the vocabulary of the apostles while slowly shifting the epistemic foundation underneath that vocabulary. And once that foundation shifts, the words remain, but their internal gravity changes. If you go back to the apostolic proclamation itself, the first thing that should strike you is what is not there. The apostles don't begin by saying, here is a spiritual experience you must have. They don't begin by saying, here is a philosophical system about God. They don't begin by saying, here is a moral code that will bring you close to God. They begin with something far more concrete and in some ways far more dangerous. They begin with a historical claim. The claim is that God promised specific things through the messianic prophetic word and then fulfilled those promises in history through Jesus. When Jesus rebukes the disciples for unbelief, he doesn't accuse them of lacking spiritual sensitivity. He accuses them of not understanding Moses and the prophets. He anchors their failure of faith in their failure to recognize prophetic fulfillment. And then he walks them through the scriptures and shows them how what happened to him was already spoken beforehand, like in Luke 24:25-27, Luke 24:44, Acts 2:22-36, and especially 1 Corinthians 15:3-4. This is extraordinarily important, and it's easy to miss because modern Christianity is so used to starting with inward categories. The apostles didn't start with inward categories. They started with outward demonstration interpreted through prior oracular promise. Faith is not originally defined as inward belief or inward experience. Faith was originally recognition of fulfilled promise. That means faith was epistemically grounded in history before it was grounded in personal spirituality. And this is where we have to slow down and really think carefully. Because if faith is grounded in historical prophetic fulfillment, then faith is not belief in religious ideas. It is recognition of demonstrated reality, and those are not the same category of belief. Ideas can be invented, ideas can be emotionally preferred, ideas can be culturally transmitted, but demonstrated prophetic fulfillment tied to multi-century textual continuity and historical realization cannot be generated by imagination. This is why pagan religion, despite being sophisticated and emotionally powerful, can't compete at the same epistemic level. Pagan religion can generate mythic divine death and resurrection stories. It can generate spiritual archetypes. It can generate ritual reenactments of divine drama, but it can't generate predictive prophetic fulfillment structures that are embedded across centuries and then historically realized under constraints no human can orchestrate. Now think about what this means practically. A religious system can invent a dying God. It can schedule its historical fulfillment across multiple texts, multiple authors, multiple time periods, and then produce an actual historical figure who fulfills those structures under hostile historical conditions. This is why God's work, in the apostolic sense, must be historical. Because if salvation is grounded in something humans can generate internally, then salvation collapses into psychology. If salvation is grounded in something humans can generate institutionally, then salvation collapses into authority. But if salvation is grounded in God fulfilling his own prophetic word in history, then salvation exists objectively before any human response ever happens. Now, once you understand that, you can begin to see why the word works became so deeply misunderstood across church history. Because once Revelation shifts away from prophetic historical fulfillment, works has to be redefined. If Revelation becomes sacramental mediation, works becomes participation currency. If Revelation becomes internal spiritual experience, works becomes moral performance. But in the apostolic frame, the condemned works are not doing things. The condemned works are human attempts to construct covenant standing through performative identity action. This is where Paul becomes extremely important, because Paul is not using words randomly. He's constructing a theological grammar. When Paul uses the word ergon in polemical context, he is not talking about activity in general. He's talking about activity that is positioned as righteousness generating. Activity that attempts to construct covenant standing. Pistis, on the other hand, is not bare belief, it is allegiance grounded in recognized reality. Hypakoē collapses faith and obedience into a single essential response. And alētheia is not abstract correctness, it is revealed reality. Something that confronts and exposes and demands alignment or resistance. See Romans 3:21 through 26, Romans 10:16 through 17, and Galatians 3:1 through 5. Now, if you put these together, Paul's system becomes extremely coherent. God performs the decisive ergon in history through messianic fulfillment. That ergon produces objective revelatory alētheia. And alētheia confronts man and calls forth pistis. And that pistis is already hypakoē at the level of the inner man. Paul is not contrasting faith versus action. Paul is contrasting God-initiated revelatory work producing obedience/faith versus man-initiated covenant construction attempts. Now, this naturally raises an anthropological question. Can humans fake faith? The answer is both yes and no. Humans can fake religious behavior. Humans can fake religious language. They can fake group identity. But humans can't indefinitely fake what they actually believe is real when forced into existential decision. Modern neuroscience supports this in fascinating ways. When a human being becomes convinced that something is real, in an internal sense, it reorganizes predictive processing networks in the brain. It changes how the person evaluates risk, how they anticipate outcomes, how they structure meaning, and how they make decisions under pressure. A person can temporarily behave contrary to what they believe is real if social pressure is strong enough. But over time, cognitive dissonance fractures either behavior or belief. And this is why performance religion historically collapses under persecution, while conviction faith often intensifies. Because performance religion is socially reinforced, conviction faith is reality enforced. Psychologically, ritual compliance is cheap. Reality submission is expensive. Ritual compliance can be learned socially. Reality submission requires identity reorganization. This is what I mean when I talk about the is what it is core of man. There's a layer of human response that can't be theatrically performed. A man can fake posture, he can fake speech, he can fake participation, but when confronted with what he knows is real and forced into decisions, something deeper activates. That is the layer the apostolic gospel is targeting. Now we can reintroduce the two action model clearly. Physical works in the polemical New Testament sense originates in man, aims to construct righteousness, can be performed without inner transformation, and can be socially stimulated. Spiritual response originates in encounter with demonstrated divine reality, aims at truthful alignment rather than righteousness construction, cannot be faked because it occurs at the level of what a man believes is real, and is forced into existence by confrontation with truth rather than invented by willpower. In this model, God's work creates salvific reality. Man's response is the interface where that reality is accepted or resisted. God's work is causative. Man's response is decisional. God's work is provisionary. Man's response is recognition and confession. And this leads us to something even deeper. If faith is recognition of demonstrated prophetic fulfillment, then the church has been missing something deeper than faith versus works. The church has never fully asked what revelation actually is, because somewhere across history, revelation slowly stopped meaning God demonstrating himself in history under his prophetic word and started meaning something else. And if that shift is real, then it means the entire structure of faith across the ages has been built upon a quiet substitution. In the next episode, we examine the single most overlooked shift in Christian history, when revelation stopped meaning God acting in history according to his messianic prophetic word and started meaning internal religious awareness, doctrinal possession, or institutional mediation.